Hello, and welcome to another edition of AI Contract Documents videos. Today is April 16th, 2020. In today's video, we're going to be talking about contract negotiations during COVID-19, which is, of course, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and AIA's standard form contracts. My name is Jimmy Germano, and I'm joined by my colleagues Mike Koger and Ken Cobley, and we are joined by special guest Chris Lasky, who we'll introduce here momentarily. As always, we cannot give legal advice on this video, and nothing you hear in this video should be considered a substitute for consulting with an attorney who's licensed in your jurisdiction and who can talk to you about the specific contracts you may have and the specifics of the situation that you're in. Also, it's important to understand that the COVID-19 pandemic is causing these issues to constantly evolve a little bit more quickly than usual. So some of the material we discussed today might be out of date, just a couple of days or a couple of weeks from now if you're watching this in the future. So be sure to double check that any applicable laws or contracts or proclamations that we may discuss here today are still in place at the time that you're going to research that issue. And there's a little bit more of our disclaimer here explained on the screen. As I said, my name is Jimmy Germano. I'm an attorney, manager, and counsel with the AI Contract Documents. I'm joined by my colleague, Mike Koger, who is the director and counsel of AI Contract Documents. And as I said, our guests today are Ken Cobley, who is the managing director and counsel with the AI Contract Documents program. And our special guest today is Chris Lasky, who is the vice president of development for the Davis companies. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Mike Koger to start our good discussion.
All right. Thank you, Jimmy. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here to talk about negotiating contracts in the COVID-19 era. And we've got, and I think the interesting thing that's going on now is, owners and contractors, we have some knowledge of the pandemic. We know that it's impacting the way folks do business. We know it's impacting materials and labor force, but right now we don't know the full extent of things. So that's why it is so interesting to talk about how do you address these kinds of issues in contracts. So I guess I'll just start it off, Chris, by talking with you first and asking you the first couple of questions. You have an interesting background. You are an architect. You started your career as an architect, but I understand you worked, as a construction manager, you worked with development companies, your current role is with the developer. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what your current role is now?
Yeah, so I started my career as an architect. As you said, I ran a small firm that I owned, about 10, 11 people. Then I did operate a construction management firm for about 8 years. And now I am on the owner's side in a real estate investment management development company that's based in Boston. I am in Pittsburgh managing this region and surrounding region. So really what my role is as it pertains to the conversation today is I do contract with architects, with the contractors, selections, and then manage the projects from cradle to grave, really.
Okay, so this video is premised on the idea that there are new contracts being entered into between owners and contractors. Are you guys? Is that a false premise? Are you guys actually still entering into contracts now and dealing with these issues, or are you holding off on contracts and entering into new work?
Well, we are definitely continue to enter into contracts. These force majeure events are in every contract. Nobody really seems to use them, and now everybody's using them. But projects have not stopped. We continue to work on projects that were in process prior to this and will be in process after. The real struggle that we're having, or I think that the industry as a whole is having, is this uncertainty as to when things can get back to any sort of level of normal. And so there's two parts to it. There's how do you contract for that in new contracts going on now, and how do you manage the existing contracts that you have with the current language.
Okay. So Ken, I'll take it over to you. And you have a unique position, with AIA. I mean, you have contacts throughout the industry. As what Chris is describing, is that what you've heard from from your contacts as well that there is, people are obviously struggling to kind of address the force majeure clauses with contracts that are already in place, but that they are still, looking forward to and attempting to enter into contracts now. Is that what you've been hearing?
Yes, absolutely. So even as recently as the beginning of this week, we were getting inquiries through our customer service line asking how people are expected to address the uncertainty of the labor market or the material supply market as they're trying to finalize contracts for construction. So we got some inquiries about that. I also had the opportunity to participate in a couple of conference calls with attorneys from around the country that are involved in construction projects and construction law. And they were talking about these concepts both in terms of contracts that they're trying to finalize for projects that they anticipate to start in the future, as well as trying to manage these changes in supply chain and labor chain on ongoing projects and trying to deal with negotiating fair terms with the contractor that'll allow the project to continue rather than force any of the parties to exercise some of the force majeure clauses and actually terminate an ongoing contract because that's the better option than facing uncertainty without a negotiated solution. So I've heard it come up in both contexts that Chris mentioned.
Interesting. So what kind of strategies can contractors and owners, what should they be starting to think about with this uncertainty, either from just a conceptual standpoint or from what you've heard people in practice doing? Any ideas for how they can start to address uncertainty on their contracts?
Sure. So the things that I've heard kicked around and actually some of the things that I've suggested that people consider include moving away perhaps from a stipulated sum agreement to something that actually compensates the contractor for the actual cost of the work plus a fee, and then considering a guaranteed maximum price or some other cap on it, or including allowances as part of a stipulated sum. So if you feel comfortable about certain elements and you can put a hard fixed number on it, do that. But as part of the global fixed price, or even perhaps as part of a guaranteed maximum price, include an allowance for those items that are uncertain, with everybody knowing then that the actual price of that material or the actual labor costs are going to be tallied at the time, but you've got an allowance in there to bump up against, or a guaranteed maximum price to bump up against.
Okay, so I'd like to break down the allowance issue a little bit. So can you kind of just describe exactly, so an allowance is a certain amount of money that's set aside for a certain type of item that maybe the price on that is uncertain at that particular time, but then as time to procure those items draws nearer, you can actually use that allowance money. Is that how it's supposed to be set up?
Sure. So allowances can serve a couple of different purposes. Sometimes in the normal course, if a particular finish or a particular product hasn't been selected yet, a contractor can put an allowance number into a contract and say, okay, I don't know exactly what finish you want in this area or these areas, but we're going to use this as a plug number, and so this is what's built into the price I've given you, and then we'll have to see what the actual item is that you select, but here's what I've got built into my fixed sum already. So that's how allowances can work with materials. I think that if written clearly enough, you can also build in allowance type numbers for trade contractors, understanding that if when you buy the job, that price goes up, then there's going to have to be some further negotiation with the owner about how they want to proceed in light of the fact that the labor market has hardened and you can't get a trade contractor to buy the work that for the amount that was allowed within the contract. Mike, there's one other thing that I've also been suggesting to people outside of the allowance realm, and that is that parties consider releasing a project in phases so that they can price out and begin work, perhaps site work and some foundation work and stuff, where they might be able to get a hard price and do that much before releasing the rest of the project and wait for the economy to turn or for things to play out so that they know what the costs are going to be for materials and for labor as you get into more intense portions of the project. When you've got multiple trade contractors and a lot of people scrambling around to get finishes done. So that's another strategy that I've suggested people look at, depending on the circumstances of the project.
Well, yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, I don't want to get too granular in it, but there's also what we're seeing is that idea of certainty and uncertainty. So we are seeing contractors under the direction of owners pre-purchasing materials. So you might just be going into the ground now, but you'll purchase all of your drywall, all of your metal studs, and you'll warehouse that either on site or in the general contractor's warehouse, so you have some certainty that it is there and there's not going to be any kind of a supply chain issue. Materials that are coming from overseas turn into a real big problem. And then when you look at things like labor costs and you know, when things do start to turn back to normal, there will be some restrictions as to how people can work and the proximity that they can work in. So looking at items like a straight time second shift, you know, and being able to still try to get the same amount of work done in a 24-hour period just by pulling shifts apart, so you can get more people working and they're not necessarily working over top of one another. So there are those kind of concepts, but it all really comes back to the general trend in the industry as a whole, more collaboration and more understanding and sharing of the risk involved, especially in this uncertain environment we're operating in.
A very good point. And Chris, are you noticed, so with your company, are you finding it desirable to actually pay the contractors ahead of time for pre-purchasing? Are you guys willing to go that route just to get the certainty of price, and then perhaps even to be paying them for, you know, the overtime that might be second shifts? Is that, it sounds like you guys are doing that already, right?
Yeah, we're having those conversations, and when it comes to procuring material, you're really just looking at advancing that draw schedule, right? It's just getting that money out sooner, and that involves more conversations with the lending institutions, with all the financing, and also stress testing, you know, the entire business model and your contractors. And you know, it's a storm that we're all in, and the best way to weather it is to work together and keep the project moving. And different jurisdictions have different rules and regulations as to how you can operate. Now, we operate throughout the eastern half of the United States, and what may be working in one state is not necessarily allowable in another. So we're sort of having to be fluid and flexible as to how we roll some of these programs out.
Good deal. So, Ken, I want to go back and ask you some follow-up questions on some things that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned two different types of pricing, cost plus and then fixed fee or stipulated sum. I assume most people understand stipulated sum and fixed fee kind of pricing. It's just a lump sum for all the construction work. Cost plus might be a little bit foreign to folks who've done, you know, the fixed pricing in the past. Can you know, if I'm a contractor and I'm brand new to cost plus contracts, can you give me some reassurances or tell me kind of some of the features about, you know, how is cost of the work quantified and how am I going to get reimbursed? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The way that the contractor is paid is, as the name implies, they're going to be paid for the actual cost that they incur to do the work, whether it's to purchase the materials or to based on their contracts with trade contractors or to supply labor themselves. They're going to be paid those costs, and then they're going to be paid a fee on top of those costs that usually is intended to cover things like overhead and anticipated profit on the job, although fee can sometimes gobble in a few other elements as well, but usually it's overhead and profit. And the way those costs are determined, for example, in an AIA contract, there's a large segment of our cost plus agreements. For design bid build work, it's the A102 and the A103. For CM at risk or CM as constructor, it's the A133 and 134. We have cost plus options in almost every delivery model, but those are the main ones. In those contracts, you will find entire sections that delineate the costs to be reimbursed. And so it goes through a descriptor of the various kinds of costs that are actually going to be reimbursed to the contractor. There's an opportunity to fill in the contractor's fee. It can be a percentage of the cost. It can be a fixed fee that is distributed as the costs get burned down, and so on and so forth. Each payment application that the contractor submits will include the cost, a line item statement of the cost, and then the backup required by the owner, the architect, the lender to verify the actual cost so that they can get paid for the costs and then have the fee applied.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's also a bit more, like if I'm a contractor and I'm just working on a fixed fee basis, I don't really have to keep track of my costs, but there's a little bit more of an administrative burden for contractors. Is that a fair statement when you're doing a cost plus kind of a methodology?
I think so, but I think that having the person with the practical experience with that is probably Chris. So I'd punt that over to Chris.
So can you repeat that for me? Kind of phased out a little bit.
Sure. So maybe we'll start, Chris, by does your company have a preferred delivery method or pricing method for when you hire contractors? Do you like to do fixed fee, or do you guys use cost plus at all?
We will use fixed fee. We'll use GMP with a fee, and then whenever uncertainties come up, like we're dealing with now, we deal with those on a case-by-case basis. But we will typically be bringing on a CM early on in the process, prior to the drawings being done, to have a little bit of design assist from the CM. We find that gives us a little bit of a better product going out to market, but also has the buy-in from the CM as the designs happen. And that tends to just give us a better outcome, we believe.
Chris, just to follow up on that a little bit, sort of a hypothetical based on what you were just talking about. Let's say you or a decent-sized contractor or an owner started negotiating a stiff sum contract maybe in January or early February. And it's complicated negotiations, so it's been taking a while. And now, in the last couple of weeks, maybe the calculus is starting to change where that type of payment method doesn't really make sense anymore. So I guess my question is, if there's a contractor watching this or a smaller owner watching this saying, at what point in time do I suggest that we abort the stiff sum and maybe go over to a cost plus type model or vice versa? What types of factors should go into that consideration, or what would you look for to say, what, now it's time to switch over, let's shelve those negotiations for now, let's go over to this type? Is that something you'd consider? How does that play out?
Yeah, so everything's fact-based. So, there is an impact on every business. I don't think anybody's untouched by what's going on now, and it's an open conversation. I mean, we typically get very detailed into how the execution of a project will carry through based on the contractor's plan. And it's very easy to look through that and say, what has changed? What are your new costs? And you get into more of an open book environment. You know, you're not going to have a successful project if you're holding the contractor's feet to the fire and they go under before the project's complete. So, you know, again, it goes back to the collaboration and to sharing some of this risk and making these decisions and the modifications based on fact.
Yeah, good point. Before we close out this video, I want to address two more issues that we've kind of talked around a little bit, but I think deserve a little bit more attention, particularly when we're talking about cost-plus contracts as being an alternative to deal with uncertainty. And that is, you know, we've thrown out the phrase guaranteed maximum price. And then one other topic we haven't talked about yet is savings. When the contractor comes in, the final cost comes in under the guaranteed maximum price. So I guess I'll loft those both up to anybody. Does anyone want to give a shot at describing what we mean by guaranteed maximum price and then talk a little bit about savings?
I could take a crack. I mean, you know, the guaranteed maximum price is basically looking at the work to be done, budgeting it out based on actual bids, on assumptions. There's a certain amount of risk that the contractor is going to take on. They balance that through a certain amount of contingencies that they add in there. But it is an open book process where the bids are all, the subcontracts are all shared with the owner. When you get to the idea of savings, some contractors will have a shared savings clause with some type of split with the owner, where if you're able to save a certain amount of money, 20, 30, 40% can come back to the contractor to incentivize drilling down to the best price that you can get. You know, in the environment that we're in now, I would imagine that as more and more of these contracts come in, that contingency, if you're being forced into a GMP, that the contingency is going to grow in order to cover the risk that the contractor is going to be undertaking.
So coming at it from a little bit of a different perspective, maybe, when you look at GMP, and Chris hit on all this, when you look at GMP, it's sort of the contractor's, as I understand it, the contractor's best guess as to what the actual cost is going to be, and then they put a contingency over that to cover risk and uncertainty and some of the other stuff. And so there's going to be a difference, presumptively, at least theoretically, between the guaranteed maximum price, which is the most that the owner would ever have to pay for the work, and the actual costs might come in as you're paying on a cost-plus basis going forward. And then the shared savings element is cutting the contractor in on that slice of the pie between what the actual costs come in at and what the guaranteed maximum price is, so that if they come in under the guaranteed maximum price, then they're going to share in that savings, which goes to them as pure profit, as opposed to some sliver of markup if they had spent it as a cost. So that's sort of the way I see it and try to explain it to people when we're talking about those concepts.
All right. Well, I guess we are kind of getting towards the end of our time. Anyone have any kind of final thoughts for contractors and owners who are negotiating contracts right now?
Well, just saying that, you know, this is new terrain for everybody, and I think that, you know, contractors know how to do their work, and they can get creative with how to operate in the current environment. And I think it, you know, I keep coming back to the term collaboration, because that's really what is needed here to figure out what these problems are, what the challenges are, and to get creative with everybody around the table, figure out how best to address it and to move the project forward.
Chris, you've said collaborate, cooperate several times, and I don't think that concept can be understated. these conditions that we find ourselves in now are much different than I think a lot of the contracts even anticipate, because most of the times the terms of the contract anticipate unique problems that might occur on a particular project. But we're facing problems that are spanning across an entire industry now. And so it's not that you have a poor performing contractor who might be running into problems. You have a contractor that may be doing everything conceivable, and they simply are running into economic factors and social factors that they cannot overcome. And the same thing is true perhaps from the owner's perspective. And so I do think that in these unusual times, folks should always understand their rights under a contract, but they should also be trying to think outside the box a little bit, and instead of just looking to the contract and trying to invoke contract terms, maybe it's better to speak with each other and their lawyers and work around some of these terms so that they can keep the project going and the contracts in play, even if they have to make some alterations to them.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, at that, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. And if you have any questions, if you're continuing on with the end of this video, if you have any questions, contact us at our documents information at the AIA. You can see the phone number should be up on the screen right here. You can always go to aiacontracts.org to learn more. Thank you very much.